The clock on the wall read 2:37 a.m. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Malcolm Carter sat at the edge of his bed, rubbing his tired eyes. He hadn't slept properly in days. Then it happened again. A sound, low, distant whispers, carried by the wind. Malcolm's heart tightened. He turned his head toward the window, his pulse picking up speed. The whispers weren't coming from inside. They were outside. Slowly he stood up and walked toward the window, careful not to wake Angela, who was fast asleep beside him. He parted the curtains just an inch, peering out into the darkness. His stomach dropped. Across the street, under the dim glow of the street lamp, 3 figures stood motionless facing his house. Their faces were obscured in shadows, their posture unnervingly still. A chill ran down Malcolm's spine. This was the 3rd night in a row. At first he thought it was paranoia, just his mind playing tricks on him. But last night he had seen footprints in the front yard, and now, this. He let the curtain fall back into place, breathing deeply, trying to convince himself that maybe they were just neighbors standing outside for some reason. At 2:30 in the morning? No, that didn't make sense. Then scratch, scratch, scratch. Malcolm froze. The sound was coming from the back door. His pulse pounded in his ears. He turned his head, his feet moving on instinct toward the kitchen. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was dragging sharp nails across the wooden door. Then knock, knock, knock. It was soft but firm. Malcolm swallowed hard. His hands clenched into fists. Every muscle in his body screamed at him not to open the door. And then, just as he took another step forward, something slipped underneath the door. A small, crumpled piece of paper. For a long moment Malcolm just stared at it. His breath felt trapped in his throat. Finally he reached down, with trembling fingers, and picked it up. The paper was rough, torn at the edges, as if ripped from an old notebook. As he unfolded it, his blood ran cold. Scrawled in uneven red ink were 4 words. "Leave while you can." Malcolm's breath hitched. He turned his head toward the window again. The figures were gone. The night outside was empty. But the house suddenly felt very, very full. The day they moved in, everything felt perfect. The house was beautiful. A 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch, freshly painted white with deep blue shutters. It was the kind of home Malcolm Carter had dreamed of owning for years. A fresh start, a better life. As he stepped out of the moving truck, Malcolm inhaled deeply, taking in the crisp suburban air. This was it, the beginning of something great. Angela wasn't as convinced. She stood by the front steps, arms crossed, watching as their new neighbors peeked out from behind curtains or lingered just a little too long on their lawns. Their smiles were tight, their waves stiff, politeness wrapped in something colder. Malcolm brushed it off. "Just give it time," he said. But time only made things worse. At first the signs were subtle. A neighbor across the street, an older man with graying hair, would sit on his porch, coffee cup in hand, watching. Not reading a newspaper, not looking at his phone, just staring at their house. Angela tried to convince herself she was imagining it, until she waved one morning. The man didn't wave back, didn't even blink, just kept watching. Jayden had his own troubles. On his first day at school, he quickly realized he was the only black student in his class. Whispers followed him down the hall. Why'd they move here? That's the new problem. He ignored it until lunch. As he walked toward an empty table, a boy stuck out his foot. Jayden barely caught himself before hitting the floor. Laughter rippled through the cafeteria. The boy smirked. Oops. Jayden clenched his fists, but said nothing. His mother's voice echoed in his head, "Stay out of trouble." Trouble, however, found them anyway. The next morning, Angela stepped outside to get the mail and stopped dead in her tracks. Their car, the one Malcolm worked extra shifts to afford, was vandalized. Long, deep scratches ran along the driver's side door, and in thick, jagged letters someone had carved, "Go back." Angela felt her stomach twist. She knew this was coming. When Malcolm saw it, his jaw tightened, his hands flexing at his sides. Jayden saw it too, and the look in his son's eyes, that mix of anger and silent pain, broke him. Angela reached for her husband's hand. "We knew this wasn't going to be easy." Malcolm exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, but I didn't think it'd start this fast." As they stood there, a car rolled by slowly. The driver didn't stop, didn't wave, just watched. The fresh start they had hoped for? It was already unraveling. The morning air was thick with an unsettling silence. No birds chirping, no distant sounds of neighbors starting their day, just stillness. Angela opened the front door to grab the newspaper, but as soon as she stepped onto the porch, she gasped. A dead animal lay at their doorstep. A rabbit, its fur matted with dried blood, its small body twisted unnaturally. The sight made her stomach turn. "Malcolm?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Malcolm rushed to her side, his face darkening at the gruesome scene. He immediately pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police." The officer who arrived was a tall, broad-shouldered white man with a casual smirk, as if the whole thing was an inconvenience. He barely glanced at the rabbit before pulling out a notepad. "Looks like a stray cat got to it," he said. "Nothing to worry about." Malcolm stepped forward. "Nothing to worry about? Someone left this here, on our doorstep." The officer sighed. "Could be kids messing around. Halloween's a few weeks away. Pranks happen." Angela crossed her arms. "You don't think this was intentional?" The officer scribbled something, then looked up. "Unless you got proof that someone did this to threaten you, it's just a coincidence." Malcolm clenched his jaw. Coincidence? That word felt like a slap in the face. Before leaving, the officer offered a forced smile. "You folks have a good day." The Carters watched as he got into his patrol car and drove away, leaving them alone with the rotting carcass on their doorstep. That night, as Malcolm lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from above. His breath hitched. The house was old, sure, but this wasn't the house settling. Someone was walking on their roof. Malcolm sat up, listening closely. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, a soft creak from outside the bedroom window. He turned his head sharply, staring at the curtain-covered glass. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Was someone out there? He was about to get up when suddenly a voice. Soft, innocent. "Daddy?" Malcolm turned to see Zoe standing in the hallway, clutching her teddy bear. Her little feet were bare against the wooden floor, her hair slightly messy from sleep. His pulse slowed. "Zoe, what is it, baby?" She looked up at him with wide eyes. "The Shadow Man says you should leave." A shiver crawled down Malcolm's spine. "What?" She hugged her teddy tighter. "He told me. He said bad things are coming." Malcolm forced a calm smile, swallowing the unease rising in his chest. "Sweetheart, there's no Shadow Man." Zoe didn't argue. She just stared. A few days later, Malcolm arrived home to find a crowd gathered at the end of the street. Neighbors stood in a huddle, speaking in hushed voices, passing around a clipboard. His stomach sank. Jayden and Angela were on the porch, watching. They already knew. Angela handed Malcolm a piece of paper she had grabbed from the mailbox. At the top, bold and clear, were the words, Petition to remove the Carter family, disturbing the peace. Malcolm's blood boiled. His hands gripped the paper so tightly it nearly tore. "We barely speak to anyone," he muttered. "How the hell are we disturbing anything?" Angela exhaled sharply. "They don't want us here, Malcolm, and they're making it clear." As if to drive the point home, an older white woman, Mrs. Hawkins, broke away from the group and walked toward them. She stopped a few feet away, her face tight with concern. She leaned in slightly and spoke low enough that only Angela could hear. "Take your kids and leave." Her voice was urgent. "It's not safe here." Angela's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Hawkins glanced over her shoulder at the group, then back at Angela. "Just trust me." Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Angela with a terrible feeling in her gut. Vanished in the night. The house was silent. Too silent. Malcolm woke with a start, his body tense. Something felt wrong. Then he heard it, a faint rustling sound. He sat up, glancing at the clock. 3:12 a.m. The unease in his chest tightened as he swung his legs over the bed and stood. Angela stirred beside him. "What's wrong?" she mumbled sleepily. Malcolm didn't answer. He was already moving down the hallway, his bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The house was wrapped in darkness except for a sliver of moonlight slipping through the blinds. Then he saw it. Jayden's bedroom door was open. His stomach dropped. He moved faster, stepping inside, his breath caught in his throat. The bed empty. Jayden was gone. The window was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the cold night air. The panic sets in. "Jayden!" Angela's scream was pure terror. She pushed past Malcolm, rushing to the bed, her hands shaking as she touched the crumpled blankets. "Where is he? Where's my baby?" Malcolm's pulse roared in his ears. He ran to the open window and leaned out, scanning the backyard. Nothing, just darkness. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Angela grabbed her phone with trembling hands. "I'm calling the police." Zoe appeared in the doorway, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Mommy?" Angela turned, trying to steady her voice. "Baby, go back to your room." Zoe clutched her teddy bear, looking at the empty bed. The shadow man took him. Angela's blood ran cold. "What?" Zoe's voice was eerily calm. "He said it's his turn now." Indifferent police response. The red and blue lights of the police cars flashed outside, but inside the Carter home the air was thick with despair. Two officers stood in Jayden's room, bored expressions on their faces. One of them, Officer Reynolds, jotted something in his notepad while chewing gum obnoxiously. "So, you're sure he didn't just run away?" Angela's rage flared. "My son would not run away." The second officer, a younger man with a lazy stance, sighed. "Look, kids get upset. They leave. It happens all the time. Are you sure there wasn't a fight or something?" Malcolm clenched his fists. "Do you hear yourself? He didn't leave. He was taken. His window was open." Officer Reynolds shrugged. "Could have snuck out. Teenagers do dumb things." Angela lost it. "He is 14. You think he just climbed out in the middle of the night and disappeared?" The officers exchanged glances. Then Officer Reynolds closed his notepad with a soft smack. "We'll file a report. If he doesn't turn up in 48 hours, we'll look into it." Angela's breath hitched. 48 hours? That's standard protocol, ma'am." Malcolm stepped forward, his voice like a knife's edge. "If a white kid went missing from this neighborhood, you'd have half the damn force looking for him tonight." A tense silence fell between them. The second officer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "We'll keep an eye out." Then they left. The chilling note. After the officers were gone, Malcolm collapsed onto Jayden's bed, running a hand down his face. Angela stood frozen, staring at the empty space where her son should have been. Then she noticed something. A piece of yellowed paper sticking out from under the bed. With trembling hands, she knelt down and pulled it free. The paper felt old, stained, as if it had been hidden there for years. Her eyes widened as she read the words written in faded ink. This has happened before. Angela's breath came in sharp gasps. What the hell did that mean? Malcolm frowned. What is that? Angela couldn't speak. She turned and ran downstairs. She needed answers. The terrifying discovery. Angela dug through the kitchen drawer, grabbing her laptop. Her hands moved fast, typing furiously into the search bar. Then she froze. An old newspaper article from 30 years ago appeared on the screen. The headline made her skin crawl. Local boy, 14, vanishes from his bedroom, never seen again. Her vision blurred as she stared at the grainy black and white photo. The missing boy looked eerily similar to Jayden. Same age, same build, same house. Her heart nearly stopped. Angela whispered in horror. It was this house. It was our house. Angela sat in the dimly lit living room, her laptop screen glowing in the darkness. Her hands trembled as she clicked through archived news reports. Missing black families, unsolved cases, vanished without a trace. Every few decades, a black family moved into this neighborhood, and every time, they disappeared. Malcolm leaned over her shoulder, his jaw clenched. This can't be a coincidence. Angela scrolled further. One article caught her eye. No evidence, no suspects, authorities. Close case on missing Peterson family. She clicked it open, her breath shallow. The date, 1992. That was the last family before them. A family of 4, a father, a mother, a teenage boy, a little girl. Angela's stomach turned, just like them. A chilling realization settled over them. This neighborhood swallows people whole. Determined to get answers, Malcolm and Angela decided to confront the people around them. They started with Mrs. Hawkins, the only one who had warned them. She opened the door just a crack, eyes darting behind them. Fear. You shouldn't be here, she whispered. Angela stepped forward. Tell us what's going on. Mrs. Hawkins hesitated, then whispered, It's not just racism. It's worse. They're watching. Malcolm's fist tightened. Who? Mrs. Hawkins's face twisted with guilt. All of them. Angela's chest tightened. What do you mean, all of them? The woman shook her head. They let you move in because they needed new blood, just like the others, just like the Petersons. Angela's pulse pounded. Who took Jayden? Mrs. Hawkins pressed her lips together. I can't. Then she froze. Her eyes flickered past them, looking at something behind them. Her face drained of color. She slammed the door. Malcolm and Angela turned. Their neighbor, Mr. Grayson, stood across the street, watching. He wasn't alone. Others stood with him. Men, women, some holding coffee cups, others pretending to read their newspapers. Angela grabbed Malcolm's arm. We need to go. They rushed back home, but as soon as Malcolm stepped onto their porch, he stopped cold. A fresh note was nailed to their door. Stop digging. That night, Malcolm pulled out an old map of the neighborhood. He marked every house connected to a missing black family. Angela whispered, Oh my God. Nearly half the houses had a dark past. Malcolm stood up abruptly. I'm going to talk to that bastard. He stormed across the street to Mr. Grayson's house. Grayson answered the door calmly, as if he was expecting him. A thin smile stretched across his face. Malcolm, he said smoothly. What a surprise. Malcolm's hands curled into fists. Where's my son? Grayson sighed, shaking his head. You people never learn. Angela, standing behind Malcolm, felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What does that mean?" she asked. Grayson's smile didn't fade. "This neighborhood isn't for you. It never was." Malcolm shoved him. "Where is my son?" Grayson's expression darkened. He leaned in, his voice low and cold. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Angela grabbed Malcolm's arm. "We need to leave, now." But deep down, she knew it was too late. The discovery. A hidden nightmare below. Malcolm and Angela knew they had no time left. Jayden was somewhere in this neighborhood, and if they didn't find him soon, they might never see him again. Angela's mind raced back to Mrs. Hawkins's warning. "It's worse than just racism." That's when she remembered. The Peterson family, the last black family that disappeared. She grabbed her laptop and searched the house records. Then she found it. The Petersons had lived in Mr. Grayson's house. Her blood turned to ice. Jayden was in there. That night, Malcolm and Angela crept toward Grayson's house. The entire neighborhood was asleep, or at least pretending to be. The house was dark, silent, but they could feel it. Something was inside. Angela's hand shook as she tried the back door. It was unlocked. They stepped inside. So, the living room looked normal, too normal, almost like a set staged for outsiders. Then Malcolm saw it. A rug, slightly out of place in the center of the floor. He ripped it away. Beneath it, a metal hatch. Angela's breath hitched. A hidden basement. Malcolm grabbed a crowbar and forced it open. A damp, rotting smell hit them instantly. A ladder led down into pure darkness. They hesitated. Then a muffled cry. Without thinking, Malcolm climbed down first. Angela followed, gripping the cold metal rungs. Their feet hit solid ground. The air was thick, heavy, like a tomb. Then the light flickered on. Angela gasped. The walls were covered in old photographs, black and white pictures of families, dozens, maybe hundreds, all black. Newspaper clippings with headlines, "Family mysteriously vanishes. Authorities close case. Due to lack of evidence, no bodies ever found." Then they saw the relics. Shoes, baby dolls, wedding rings. Angela's stomach turned. This wasn't just about them. This had been happening for decades. A generational horror. A small wooden door sat at the end of the bunker. Malcolm rushed forward, yanking it open. Inside, Jayden. His wrists were tied, his face tear-streaked. "Dad," he choked. Malcolm pulled him into his arms. Relief, rage, fear, all at once. But Angela wasn't looking at Jayden. She was looking at the symbols carved into the walls, ritualistic markings. That's when she realized this wasn't just about keeping black families out. This neighborhood fed on them. The door behind them creaked. They weren't alone. A figure stepped into the room. Mr. Grayson. Behind him, the neighbors. Men, women, even teenagers. Holding knives, ropes, and horrifying old relics. Angela whispered, "It's a cult." Grayson smiled. "You weren't supposed to dig?" Malcolm clenched his fists. "We're leaving. Move." Grayson sighed. "You think it's that simple?" Then he snapped his fingers. The lights flickered. The door behind them slammed shut. Angela grabbed Jayden's hand. "Run!" They bolted. Malcolm slammed into Grayson, knocking him down. Angela grabbed a metal pipe from the wall and swung hard, cracking another neighbor's skull. Jayden sprinted toward the ladder. More neighbors flooded the room. Angela kicked one in the stomach. Malcolm grabbed a chair and smashed it into Grayson. Jayden climbed up first. He flung open the hatch. Angela shoved Malcolm up before scrambling behind him. Grayson grabbed her ankle. "You can't escape this." Angela kicked him square in the face. He crashed backward. She clawed her way up. Malcolm yanked her out. They slammed the hatch shut. The Carters ran. They didn't stop, didn't look back. They jumped in their car and sped off. Angela was shaking. Jayden was sobbing. Malcolm's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. We're never coming back. The neighborhood sign passed by in a blur. Welcome to Evergreen Oaks. The nightmare was behind them. Or so they thought. Because as they disappeared down the road, a single porch light flickered on. A shadowy figure stepped out. He watched them go. Then he smiled. Fade to black. Ending revenge or tragic sacrifice. The Carters had escaped, but it wasn't over. Angela sat in the motel room, hands trembling as she flipped through the horrifying evidence they had taken from the bunker. Old photographs, relics, newspaper clippings, proof that this wasn't just about them. It had been happening for decades. Jayden was safe, but what about the other families before them? What about the next ones? They had two choices: run, or burn it all down. Malcolm stood in the motel bathroom, staring at his reflection. His hands tightened into fists. "They'll do it again," Angela whispered behind him. "We can't let them." Malcolm exhaled slowly, made his decision. That night they drove back. Dressed in black, gloves on, gasoline in the trunk. Evergreen Oaks was silent. The home stood tall, pristine, but underneath it was rotting with evil. They moved quickly. First, Grayson's house. Malcolm doused the porch in gasoline. Angela lit the match. Then the neighborhood sign. Then the community hall, where they held their secret meetings. The fire spread fast, a towering inferno in the dead of night. By the time the neighbors woke up, it was too late. Malcolm and Angela stood from a distance, watching it burn. The sirens blared in the distance. Angela's heart pounded. They did it. They ended it. But then headlights appeared behind them. A black SUV. The engine rumbled. It wasn't the police. Malcolm and Angela turned. A man in a dark suit stepped out. Not a neighbor. Something worse. He adjusted his tie, staring at them with cold, knowing eyes. Angela's breath hitched. This was bigger than the neighborhood, and they had just made themselves a target. Fade to black.